So I'm here with Jon Irabagon, and we're very excited to have this concert and workshop next Wednesday. Thanks so much for coming.
Oh man, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Before we jump into the specifics, I'd love to know a little bit about putting together a tour in this current climate and what kind of ups and downs you've had just trying to line up dates.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a new quartet with Matt Mitchell on piano and Chris Lightcap on electric bass and Dan Weiss on drums. And I had originally our first, I had wrote a bunch of music for it and was getting all excited for it and won a Jazz Rhodes, a South Arts Jazz Rhodes grant. And the first tour for that group on the East Coast was scheduled for April 2020. So like, just completely not just destroyed by the pandemic. And then I was able to reschedule a lot of the shows for the next April. So for April 2021, not all the shows because people just weren't able to put the shows back together. And also the vaccines were just starting to come out. So people were really nervous about it. But luckily for my group, all four of us got the vaccines like 2 weeks before the first date. And we were the first group that I know of that were back out on the road during that time. And it was super stressful, but also incredibly fun and really just life affirming. And like, man, I can't believe we're finally back here. And the audiences were super appreciative. And some people came up to us afterwards crying, like, this is the first show we've seen, this is the first live music we've seen in over a year and a half and everything. So after the success of that tour, and at the end of that tour, we recorded a record called Rising Sun, which is coming out later this year. I was like, well, I got to try to book another tour for this group. And my initial idea was to book a tour from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine, and do a bunch of stops in between. But and actually, I got all the way across America with different dates and everything. But with like we were talking about with the Omicron variant and all that, things just kind of got canceled and postponed, and so our tour isn't as contiguous as I wanted. But I'm making a couple stops out in Portland and in Spokane, obviously, and the rest of the group is going to join me on the East Coast, and we're doing 6 or 7 gigs out there, and we are playing in Portland, Maine, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a couple places in New York and Maryland and things like that. So, and I have a couple things on the West Coast in the like Los Angeles and San Francisco and things coming up too. So it's tough to coordinate a whole group, but I had been working on this tour for like a couple months, really, really hard. And so for the gigs that people couldn't sustain the whole group, I've been trying to put together local groups and try to fly out anyways, because I feel like I spent a lot of my career in Europe playing a lot over there, but during the pandemic, I wound up living in Rapid City, South Dakota for 9 months, which was a culture shock for me for sure. But my family was able to take a couple road trips, and it was fascinating, just the beauty and the wonder of that part of America, and the Black Hills and the Rocky Mountains and all that. And I hadn't really spent that much time in those areas. So because of the pandemic, one of the positive things that came out of it was I was like, you know what? I kind of want to get my music around the United States a little bit more and try to figure out what that means and how to do that. And it's a lot more difficult because things are way farther apart than in Europe. But I think there's a way to do it. And the one positive out of the pandemic was that it's kind of strengthened my resolve to try to tour more in the United States.
Great. I feel like when we talk to people about the pandemic, there's kind of two main views. Obviously, there's a lot of in between, but a lot of people with the shutdowns, a lot of people just completely stopped. They stopped practicing, all of that kind of thing. Maybe some people dealt with some depression and some things like that. And then there's the other people who just really powered through and found a new space within it. It sounds to me like you're the second type. You did a lot of projects. We can talk about the Bird with Streams and things like that. But how do you talk? What is your narrative through the pandemic and how you were able to really find your own spaces?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And everyone, all my friends that are in and out of music, all have different, all reacted differently to the pandemic. And for us, my family when we were in New York, and in March 2020 when they shut down like New York on like March 14th or whatever. And that morning, my wife and I went to the corner store to buy some toilet paper and and some milk for the kid, and like it was completely out of both of those things. So we went to the other corner store, and they had like one roll of toilet paper left and like 1 gallon of milk, and it was like $20 or something. So my wife and I looked at each other. We're like, "This is probably not the right place to be while this thing blows over." So my wife's parents live in Rapid City, South Dakota, right by the on the border of the Black Hills. So we booked a flight that morning, and 4 hours later we landed in the Black Hills. And luckily we weren't patient zero for COVID out there. It took several months for it to get out to South Dakota and stuff. And so I think it was such a culture shock. It's such a different thing for me that for the first month or so I was just really stunned, and I was like, well, what's going on here? And we thought we were going to fly out there for like 2 weeks and come back, but as we all know, that's not how the pandemic played out. And I think what happened that really helped me was um, with my 3-year-old, my grandparents were able to help out, and so I had some free time during the day, and I found a canyon that was just 5 or 6 minutes from the house, and I wound up practicing out of this canyon like for 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 6 or 7 months or something like that, and it really was a life and game changer for me. Like no one was there; it was just a bunch of animals and birds and everything, and I just had all this time that I hadn't had in years to compose out there, to practice like without an agenda, to work on music just how I wanted to work on sound, bouncing off the sides of the canyon and everything. It was really it was a it opened up a lot of avenues of thinking for me, and I think I was super lucky to have that because I could have easily gone into the shutdown depression mode, and I understand it. A lot of my friends and a lot of my family went into that, and it makes total sense. And luckily, I was able to find some space outside where it was basically just meditative practice, and I was able to just come out of it in a positive way.
What an incredible story. And then let's talk about the album that came out of that, The Bird with Streams. And I guess just talk about how practicing there became the idea to release an album.
Yeah, I mean, I was out of this canyon and hiking around the canyon too. I'd bring my lunch and I'd have a backpack, and I just hiked to different parts of it. And that day I would practice there, and the next day I'd practice a couple feet away, and just to check out different reverb kind of things and how nature would respond. And there was a really fast running stream there, so I'd try to play against it, and I really think it helped my sound a lot. So for the first 4 or 5 months, I really was just doing it just to do it, and I started jotting down some compositional ideas and working on things like that, touching up with some standards that I had lost touch with and stuff. But the last month that I was out there, when it was starting to get colder in October, November, and we were realizing we were probably nearing our time, our time's end in South Dakota, and I was like, you know what, this has been such a great experience for me. I can't leave here without documenting this in some way, if not even just for myself. Like it was just an amazing experience, so I had to like get it down in some way. So I figured out a portable rig. I bought a microphone, and it took me a couple weeks to figure it out. But like Charlie Parker's centennial was that summer, and so like that was leading me to revisit a lot of his standards, his heads that I hadn't worked on for years, and trying to do them in different keys and in different tempos. And so after a couple days of trying to figure out, okay, well, what am I going to document exactly here? I just came up with, you know what, I've never recorded an album of all standards before, let alone Charlie Parker tunes. So let me just kind of take a month and focus in, keep working in the canyon and working on different things, but focus on these Charlie Parker heads and try to come up with different angles of expression on this like really tried and true material.
That's so fascinating. And the idea of practicing in nature, I think is less common for people. The most obvious example that we think about for a saxophone, of course, is Sonny Rollins with the bridge, and there's some documentation of Ornette Coleman talking about being in nature, and I'm sure there's a lot more. But can you talk about what the sound of the saxophone and playing in different environments, specifically in nature, and the fact that that's a moving landscape, maybe, what do you get out of playing in different environments, specifically nature?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, like whatever direction you face on a given day, the sound's going to be different. Sometimes the sound gets absorbed, and like you just feel like you're playing into a rug or something. Sometimes some days the canyon was just sending the sound right back to me, and I thought I was the loudest instrument on the planet or something like that. But and certain days it was hotter, and certain days the wind was blowing in different directions, so it made your sound feel like this swirling kind of sensation thing. Some days there were tons of animals around, and I think just the vibrancy and the almost randomness from day to day with the nature thing really it really like put up my spidey senses in a lot of different ways and made me kind of be more responsible about every single sound that I was putting out and try to interact with that. I think the main thing, and also I think Rollins would have talked about this too, is like when you're playing outside for saxophone specifically, it really makes you work on your sound because, like I said, it just gets your sound gets thrown out there and it doesn't necessarily come back to you like it does in a room or in a practice room or inside. So I really feel like my sound changed a lot while I was out there, and I was really experimenting with a lot of. I was trying to come up with the ugliest saxophone sound I could for a few weeks. I was trying to come up with the most beautiful one, and just trying to find my own voice within like a wider spectrum. And I think practicing outside really allows someone to pursue those kinds of idealistic goals.
Right. And I just love that statement and the idea metaphorically of just trying to find your sound within a wider spectrum, just in life in general, and just with changing and moving environments. Can you talk about how this might affect something like extended techniques or versus standard tone, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, the record, the Bird with Streams record, it's almost all Charlie Parker tunes, and the tunes that are mine are really they're just improvising over standard forms. So it's it's really an album of standards. But for three or four of the tracks, I wanted to make sure to represent the extended technique things that I was working on. So about a fourth of the record is really strange extended technique saxophone sounds, and being outside can really support that because if you're playing up against a canyon wall and you're getting some bounce back from that, like it can, if you allow it, it really can affect. Okay, well maybe I can get the saxophone to be doing two things at once, and so for 3 hours that day, I'm like trying to use the echo of my own sounds like back to me and trying to play against it or with it or things or harmonize with it, things like that. And I've been working on extended techniques for years. I did a solo sopranino saxophone record in 2015, and that whole record I spent 3 hours a day in a practice room only on sopranino and just like trying to play no jazz on it and just trying to come up with anything else. And that record was really really life changing for me as far as my direction and what I really love about the saxophone. And so some of those ideas and even more like prescient to actually tenor saxophone, I was working on that stuff for hours and hours. So I think being outside, it supports it because it just makes you more responsible for everything because you're really out there in nature and nature's taking your sound. So it just really makes you pay attention to more of the details. And within those details, you can really get if something catches your attention, you're like, wait, I've never done that thing before, or how did I get that inside sound within a tone? Can I recreate that, and can I like expand it into a whole song or something like that? So a lot of a lot of my canyon practice time could have been wasted time in a sense. It was a lot of experimentation and a lot of dead ends, but the experimentation that actually led to something I'm super happy of, and I never would have come to it otherwise.
That's incredible. And can you talk a little bit about the bravery that it might take to just play in a public space like that? Because a lot of people would be nervous to make a noise into a space that affects many other people, and you don't know who's out there. So what's that like?
Yeah, I mean, this canyon is off the main road like just a little bit, and it's just a little bit of a hike to like the main spot that I was using. I didn't know who was there, and occasionally there'd be hikers coming through. Um, the Sturgis motorcycle rally happened while I was out there, and it wasn't right by Sturgis, but it was only about 20, 30 miles away. And that week there were tons of bikers that would just show up. And actually, man, I met a lot of cool people out there, and and I would sit down and talk to them. There was a couple of slackliners that would come through, and rock climbers, and it was really fascinating because I was there to practice, but when people would come by, people would come by and they were from Utah, or they were from Idaho, or they were from Canada, or they were from Maine. So I really got to meet a lot of people who had their own stories, and that in and of itself was fascinating. But as far as me just practicing, I just was going to go at it like as if no one was there, and for the majority of the hours, no one was there. From the main spot I was practicing, though, there was one house on the other side of the canyon, and I was looking up there, and from the beginning, I'm like, man, I hope this person doesn't mind. But I never saw anyone up there, and it was a little far, so I couldn't really tell. And about 3.5 months into me practicing every day, a guy that was walking his dog around me, and I was like, oh, hey, how's it going? He's like, hey, I live in that house up there. And at first, I'm like, oh, man, I'm so sorry if this has been bugging you. Like, just let me know. And he was like, no, you know what? I love it. And my brother and I have been working on the deck back there, and it's been music to our ears, so it's been so awesome. And so, like, we exchanged information. And the last couple months I was out there, I had dinner at his house. We took him out, him and his wife. And so I got to know a lot of people out there. And luckily, the people who were there constantly, they were supportive of the music.
Incredible. Yeah. And what a life lesson, that just put yourself out there and see what comes out of it. And, because I do think that a lot of people live their lives scared and aren't willing to just take a chance like that because they're afraid of what might happen.
I think, part of the thing that I love about jazz and improvised music is that you have to figure out who you are as a person. You have to figure out what your philosophies on life are and what you want to say. And I think the deeper you get into that, the more confidence you have with just like, well, this is how I see things. And I'm not trying to harm anybody or get in anyone's way. So if that was going to be the case, then I was going to stop and find some other canyon to practice at. But I think just the excitement of discovering this place and being able to practice outside extensively for the first time in my life and feeling this freedom and getting all these compositional ideas while I was out there and just the beautiful nature. And I mean, that part of America is like, it was like 70 degrees and sunny and low humidity the entire summer, which in New York or Chicago, where I've spent the majority of my life, it's like 100 degrees and like 100% humidity. So I didn't mind being out there at all. But yeah, I mean, I think the jazz thing and improvised music just helps you gain a little bit of confidence and just go for it,
For sure. Now, can you talk a little bit about the idea of taking a specific composer for an album? And it could be a project of any type. Who are some of the composers that you really modeled your playing after? And it could be either specific compositions or just styles.
Yeah. I mean, like, obviously I love Charlie Parker and Cannonball Adderley and people like that, bebop guys. I've never really made an album before to honor one of them. I love the style and everything, but I also am a firm believer of trying to figure out your own direction while honoring the masters too. So this was kind of a big step for me. It was really delving into Charlie Parker's music deeper than I ever had before. I had never transcribed all the Charlie Parker solos on tenor before, but for me, I was like, well, if I'm going to do this Charlie Parker album and I have my tenor with me, like, let me like dive back into Sipping at Bells and all these tunes that he recorded on tenor. So that was fascinating for me to see him trying to take a guy that I've admired on alto for so long and like try to see how do I transfer that to tenor and see what he tried to do. But like with my straight ahead jazz albums that I've made, like Wayne Schroeder has been a major influence on me compositionally. I think Kenny Wheeler, who I got a chance to play with several times in his last couple of years, he's a huge compositional force for me. I made a string quartet record. It's a piano quintet. So Matt Mitchell playing piano with the Mivos quartet, string quartet, and the 6 movement piece that I wrote is my first foray into serious string writing, and it was and they were magnificent on the record, and that writing was really influenced by like Bartók and Shostakovich and those guys and Beethoven and that level of string quartet stuff. So I try to find my people wherever I can and try to like really go overboard and dig deep and then try to come up with my own outcomes out of researching those kinds of people. I really there's a woodwind quintet by Samuel Barber called Summer Music, and man, that's like, man, I want to hear that music till the day I die. It's an incredible haunting piece for me. And so I wrote a woodwind quintet right before the pandemic started because I had a week at the Stone in New York, John's Orange Club, where you get to play a set or two every night with different musicians, and it's up to you, and there's no limitations on the music or anything like that. So I'm like, okay, so now I want to challenge myself and try to write a woodwind quintet, and that Barber piece and the Ligeti woodwind quintets and stuff. Like, I try to research all that stuff, and the ones that really hit with me, I'll take the scores and just exhaust any possibilities of examining it, and then try to come up with my own direction out of that.
That's great. Now, as a saxophone player, let's talk a little bit about the discipline it takes to get to a high level. And who were some of your early influences in becoming disciplined in that way? And what are some of the main things that you have always kept in your regimen to keep you improving?
Yeah. I had some great teachers starting out. My high school band director, Tom Beckwith, will always be a part of me and everything he taught me. I had a great, my first private teacher, Greg Fishman, is a great Stan Getz disciple, and he has his own books out. And so he really taught me the theory of everything, and because I didn't know anything before that. I studied with Mark Colby and Dick Oates and countless guys that have really instilled some serious work ethic for me. But John Coltrane is just, that's the shining light for work ethic and just going for whatever you believe in. At a certain point, when I started out as an alto player, and being from Chicago, it's a tenor town. There's a huge tenor history there. And so not long after I started on alto, I started practicing tenor and getting into that a little bit more. But maybe 20, 25 years ago or something, I was like, you know what? Like, alto and tenor, they're both saxophones, but they're not really doubles of each other. They both have their own lineages, and they both have their own things that the instruments want to say. So if I actually want to be a tenor player, as much as I want to be an alto player, I really have to study that lineage. And so I set it up upon myself to like try to learn the history of the masters, like starting from Coleman Hawkins through Lester Young to Dexter Gordon to Wayne Shorter to John Coltrane to Joe Henderson to and the list goes on and on. And what I would do is really just become obsessive with whoever I was working on at that point. So it was 6 months of Coleman Hawkins continuously. I tried to get as many recordings as I could. I had them on all the time. I picked, after listening to countless solos, I picked the ones that really moved me, transcribed them by ear, transcribed them and wrote them down, played along with the recordings, tried to solo in his style, over other songs that he didn't play. Tried to just play like that constantly. Tried to wear what he would wear. Tried to research, what his attitude was, and watch all the videos on YouTube with him. And then after a certain point, like, I just felt that absorption stop a little bit, and I'm like, okay, it's time to move on. And then I did the same with Lester Young, and I did the same with Dexter Gordon, and I got deeper into different people for different phases, like more. It was all different. It was very just by feel. I really loved Coleman Hawkins, so I stayed there for a long time. But the John Coltrane phase that I went through, I was in there for like a decade or something, transcribing. My goal when I started transcribing John Coltrane stuff was like, how did the alto player from the Army in 1947 turn into the guy that is improvising on Interstellar Space like less than 20 years later? Like, that's insane to me. So I tried to transcribe as many solos as I could in between in chronological order to try to find those building blocks that would eventually make up Interstellar Space, So I got way into that phase. And like, man, when you get inspired by somebody or something or some idea, you don't have enough time in the world to practice. You're just never bored. You're never running out of things to do in the practice room, and you're thankful for the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 hours you can squeeze in a day. And you're never out of ideas. I mean, I tell my students to never practice like never practice bored. If you're practicing bored, you're doing something wrong. You gotta, you gotta challenge yourself and come up with your own games. If you're trying to work on articulation, try to come up with your own articulations and and practice those through the keys instead of just, well, this book says I have to tongue two, slur two, tongue two. Like, okay, maybe do that, but then how can you keep it interesting for yourself? Can you reverse it at will, randomly, while you're going through the scales? Just something simple like that. And it can be, and I'll tell my students sometimes, like, if you're learning a standard, like, take a day and practice with the metronome and just improvise on that for the entire time you're practicing, because that's what you're ultimately wanting to do, is improvise on these tunes like on stage with a flow. And so some days just make yourself play continuously, and it doesn't even have to be on a tune. Can you play continuously, like creating harmonies on the spot that don't repeat but that have integrity and melodic substance that you're coming up with right there? And if I make some of my students do that on the spot, they just have no idea what to even play. So that's something that's practicable, and that's something that's unique each time you pick up your horn, and that's something that'll keep you from being bored for sure. Anything like that. And the sky's the limit, and I try to encourage my students to try to be as inventive as possible and have as much imagination as possible. You want to ask yourself, what if, more than you think you need to. And I think anybody that can come up with like 10 answers to a question as opposed to one, they're going to not be bored while they're practicing.
Right. And to be creative in that way and to come up with endless possibilities, that's really the cornerstone of improvisation, and jazz music is great for that. Can you talk a little bit about the openness of mindset and how that relates to playing more freely improvised music and free and maybe even avant-garde music?
Yeah, I mean, so we're in 2022. We're lucky enough to have had over 100 years of jazz history at this point. And it's funny, like, if I'm an average audience member, and someone makes me listen to some late period John Coltrane, that's going to sound like the strangest, craziest music that I've ever heard, and I wouldn't even necessarily call it music, right? And I understand that. And depending on what a musician's goals are for their music and their career, you may never want to approach that level of intensity or that level of intricacy, because Club A, B, C, and D, and E and F and G and H and I, they won't ever have music like that. But maybe Club J would, but that's obviously way less than those first, however many letters that is. But for me, if I'm dedicating my life to music, I want to know all the ins and outs of it, all the different kinds of music that's been made, and all the different possibilities that there are. And late period John Coltrane and Ornette, I mean, this is 60 years ago at this point. That's half of what jazz is already. It's like, the entire history of jazz, the halfway point is, I don't know, Sunship or something, right? You know what I mean? Or Shape of Jazz to Come, something like that. So for me, I think that as a musician, you have to at least be aware to a degree of what that is. And when I started researching that stuff, you're also like, in touch with the world, because it's a global thing now, and you're like, wait a second. So during the time of these late John Coltrane things in Europe, Peter Brotzmann, for example, is like, well, I'm not going to do the American thing. I want to emancipate improvisation from the swing feel, but still improvise and do a thing that's based on X, Y, and Z instead. And so I'm like, man, that's also 60 years ago. So what is that? So now I'm going to research all that. And meanwhile, in Japan, they're doing a ton of different stuff too. So I think there's so much music out there, and there's no real way to get to it all. But I think as a professional musician, I owe it to myself to at least find the things that interest me and go for that. And for better or for worse, maybe I'm cursed or whatever, Cannonball Adderley really interests me, and Wayne Shorter and Warren Marsh really interest me. But Evan Parker and Anthony Braxton and Roscoe Mitchell and Ned Rothenberg and Peter Brotzmann and Hiro Abe, they all interest me as well. And so my music is going to become some combination of reverence for really straight up American jazz and some irreverence because the ICP orchestra has done that for 50 years too. And I love all that different kind of music. I love modern classical music, and there's some way, I'll try to improvise in a 12-tone row on a swing tune, and that's a really weird challenge to try to do. And so that goes in with never being bored. But I think since music is global right now, and with iTunes and Spotify and YouTube and stuff, it's all available. And I think the more music you immerse yourself in and really try to dig deep into, the more chance you have to find your own voice within it.
Beautiful.
But there's no shortcut. It's definitely the longer way to go. And if we're going to be talking about a career in music, that's a completely different thing because careerism isn't. I mean, that's you're just trying to make money and become famous and be a star or whatever, and be on top of a pole, whatever. But I don't really care about any of that stuff. So this longer, more difficult, like more searching and responsible way of things, that's way more interesting to me, and I would rather do that and never be in a poll or something like that, and be happy with it. So and it's tough these days with the social media thing and what everyone expects, and this is a whole different topic than you've been asking me, but somehow I rambled onto this. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's just I want to be responsible for all different kinds of music that I find interesting and challenging, and somehow my music's going to reflect all of those things.
Do you feel a responsibility to help the audience through the process, or do you think that if they're with you, they're with you?
I think, hopefully, if the music that I'm making has something interesting to it that the audience can hang their hat on, some or most of the time, then that's cool. That's cool. I mean, if for my quartet music and stuff, like there's a lot of grooves and there's a lot of vamps and everything, and maybe the grooves and vamps are in weird meters or have some extended harmonies. But if an audience member is willing to go on this journey, there's something in almost all of my music. There's something for someone to grab onto. But I don't feel that compromising my music to possibly reach somebody in the audience and not know if that's guaranteed doesn't do anyone any favors.
Love it. Now, in a situation like next Wednesday, you'll be performing with new musicians, and it'll be a trio setting. So there's no chording instrument, no piano or guitar. Do you find that to be obviously to play in enjoyable, but do you find that format affects how the audience perceives the music?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started listening to Saxophone Trio stuff with like Sonny Rollins, things like Joe Lovano records and things, it's a different sound because you're not hearing the chords and you feel like stuff is missing. But I think with the collective language of the bass player and drummer that I'll be playing with, like we'll be able to connect with people, and I think, as long as the audience is willing to give it a chance, I have found that Saxophone Trio is a very approachable format, and it's actually my favorite format to play in because there's so much possibility, there's so much magic that can happen because all three of us are like in it equally, and each person has the equal responsibility for the music, and it's super exciting because it can go anywhere.